New in, it was just announced yesterday that the president of Columbia University agreed to a congressional hearing over campus anti-Semitism. Recall that a firestorm that led to the firing of two Ivy League university presidents occurred after a tense round of congressional questioning last fall. Columbia's president, Minouche Safik, did not attend that session, but will testify in mid-April along with two co-chairs of the university's Board of Trustees. Columbia University has been at the center of a roiling debate about the limits of speech on college campuses in the wake of October 7th. Pro-Palestine groups like Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine have been suspended on that campus, including Columbia's campuses and others. Senior Executive Vice President of Columbia, Gerald Roseberg, says the groups repeatedly violated university policies related to holding campus events and cited a November walkout and a die-in they held on Columbia's main campus yard as specific unauthorized events.
On the other side, Columbia has been sued by Jewish students over what they describe as endemic anti-Semitism on campus. The lawsuit claims violent and exclusionary anti-Jewish rhetoric has proliferated on campus and cited as evidence protesters chanting, "There is no safe place, death to the Zionist state." Now, Columbia launched a task force on anti-Semitism just weeks after October 7th, but it's been steeped in controversy. Students have questioned the group's refusal to define anti-Semitism. Multiple Jewish students spoke at a March 1st session of the task force, concerned that their anti-Zionism could be conflated with anti-Semitism. The Anti-Semitism task force is hiring a research director with a salary listed at between $110,000 and $135,000. Meanwhile, no task force has been established in response to concerns from Arab and Muslim students about discrimination against them, even after a chemical attack was launched against Palestine solidarity protesters in January.
Now the task force controversy has hit a fever pitch as leaked audio of University Vice President Jerry Roseberg seems to confirm some concerns of pro-Palestine students that criticisms of Israel are being characterized as anti-Semitic in and of themselves. Here to discuss is Prem Thakkar of the Intercept, who has been covering what is happening at Columbia closely for months now, including coverage of the chemical attack and this new leak from the task force. So I've been following your coverage, Prem, and it's been really interesting, specifically this debate over what the kind of role of the task force is and how it can pursue what it's supposed to ostensibly be pursuing if it won't define anti-Semitism in the first place. Can you give us some background about what's been going on there?
Yeah, so for broad background, of course, again, this stems back for months now. In November, Columbia students had the sit-in that or a die-in, I should say, that eventually led to the SJP and JVP groups being suspended. Now, as mentioned, these students are taking the school to court with regards to that suspension. And then in January is when we had the chemical attack that allegedly, dozens of students were attacked by this mysterious chemical. Some allege is skunk, a chemical that the IDF uses. That's not been confirmed yet. So there's a lot of questions around this chemical attack broadly. But in the aftermath of October 7th, the school is pretty quick to launch this task force on anti-Semitism. And it's kind of been operating somewhat mysteriously insofar as, there's been a lot of these open sessions that they've had with students that students have been able to come to kind of share their thoughts. But as our story shows, at these meetings that are open to students but closed door in nature insofar as, they're meant to be confidential, a lot of students are just kind of being spoken down to, being dismissed. Of course, these meetings naturally would be pretty charged, pretty, just emotional in nature, I suppose. But nonetheless, if you're going to host open sessions, you hope for some sort of constructive discussion, no less, at least when faced with questions about, this is a task force on anti-Semitism. How are we defining that? What are we doing to sort of confront it? A lot of students have felt that that basic question has just been dismissed.
Maybe we should get into one of these bits of leaked audio because, this really does, I think, put a fine point on it and cuts through some of the he said, she said. People can judge for themselves. Let's take a listen. Again, This is Gerald Roseberg, who is the vice president of the university.
I think when these protests go on, there is a lot of the rhetoric in the protests that is extremely upsetting to many of our students.
But what are examples of that?
So I think all the talk about genocide, all the talk about apartheid state and racist state, Minouche, Shafiq, you're supporting genocide. I think if you're saying that, you don't think, why would anybody be upset about that? But I think, I could imagine that somebody listening to that an Israeli student being told that their state is an apartheid state, a racist state committing genocide, seems to them like an incitement of violence against them.
Now, certainly a person can disagree that Israel is committing genocide, but it does seem a little odd to say that that would in and of itself be an incitement to violence, given that the ICJ preliminarily has said that what is going on in Gaza is a plausible genocide at the very least. So can you speak to that clip, what the responses to it have been, and if you can, the provenance of the clip? How do we have access to it?
Yeah, so to your second part, I should say that, shout out to the many students and faculty members who have been comfortable with sort of putting themselves at risk, getting into these conversations, leaking, and giving us a glimpse into how Columbia is responding to all of this. I would note that I believe that clip comes from a November 30th meeting that was attended by other administrators, university senators, faculty members, if I'm not mistaken. And what's notable is that just shortly after that, in December, students had confronted Rosberg again, and this clip was making rounds as well, where they asked him very straightforwardly, "Are Palestinians human?" And he responded by saying, "I refuse to be intimidated." And regardless of how an administrator might choose to respond to a lot of students confronting them on something, you'd imagine that one would at least concede that Palestinians are human beings. So I think that sort of combination of clips, I think, gives a really good insight into how Columbia is responding to this. Whereas, on one hand, there's a task force on anti-Semitism, which is, good and fine. If students of Jewish descent feel uncomfortable, they should be heard. But there's no sort of analog to the seriousness that, Muslim students or Palestinian students, or even just people who sympathize with Palestine, how they're feeling. There are overtures made towards them. And even the task force itself mentions that, they care about Islamophobia and other forms of bias as well. But it's the task force on anti-Semitism. And let alone the fact that, again, regardless of how people might feel, pained or threatened by speech, which is an ongoing debate at college campuses, students were physically attacked, and there is no task force for that. I would note as well about the status of the investigation into that attack. When I asked the university last week about, the latest update into the attack, they pointed me to a statement from January 30th, which was at that point 37 days ago. It's now 44 days since that statement was released. They told me the investigation is ongoing, and they referred me to the NYPD for more information. And one note I would add, just for a finer point on how Columbia is responding to this, is that an NYPD spokesperson told me that the case is still open. The department is the quote here is, still investigating on who the people who are wanted. They just haven't caught them yet. And the spokesperson told me there are some people who are wanted that are still unknown, which is interesting because the university also claims that they've banned the alleged perpetrators from campus. And logically, in order to enforce a ban, you have to know who you're banning. So either someone might be not fully candid with me, or perhaps the students are in hiding. I don't know which one is more likely, but there seems to be either some dishonesty or just a lack of seriousness towards a university responding to its own students who, paid to be there being attacked.
All right, so let me offer not exactly a counter perspective, but a different perspective, and invite you to respond to it. So, look, I care very deeply about free speech on college campuses. I've been writing about it for 10 years. I've followed the exploits of student activists that I often thought were hostile to the basic principles of free speech. So, look, I am as skeptical as you and Brianna are about whether a task force such as this one is really about protecting or deterring legitimate threats of violence or that kind of thing, or is it really just a political exercise in tamping down on political speech that is disfavored? I totally hear that. I totally get that. But frankly, I am very accustomed to hearing demands from liberal progressive students on college campuses for greater comfort from microaggressions and trigger warnings. We don't use many of these concepts quite as much. I think they actually have kind of fallen out of favor because the science behind them has been largely disproven. But all of these demands for greater emotional security and comfort that student activists made demanding administrators at these universities do more to protect their feelings. And perhaps this is a case of them getting now a group of students, Jewish students, are demanding those exact same kind of things, and activists are realizing that that could be bad for their own rights of political expression. Do you think that is going on here at all?
I hear that for sure. And I think I tried to allude to this slightly before where, this is an ongoing kind of debate as far as, the limits of campus speech, the responsibility or not necessarily responsibility for universities to make students feel quote unquote safe with regards to speech. That's an ongoing debate and discussion. And I'm no legal scholar. I'm just a guy who's bailed out of college myself. But I will say what makes this sort of particularly notable or particularly sort of worth discussing is just the fact that here we have, this isn't a sort of abstraction, a case where someone was physically attacked and physically made to feel unsafe. And numerous students and sort of the response to that is just not analogous at all to perhaps warranted, perhaps not warranted concerns by certain students on campus that have led to this task force on anti-Semitism. So I think it surely is a broader debate, and I hear you with regards to whether or not this is sort of Jewish students kind of making similar appeals for being safe from speech. But I think there's less abstraction here insofar as how the university itself is responding. And I think when we think of the fact that, now Columbia is appearing at the House hearing next month, I think these kinds of differences are more important to directly confront because of the fact that this university that has responded in this specific way will now go to this House hearing with regards to how it's responding to anti-Semitism. And, Representative Fox might have her own beliefs as to how Columbia is responding, but given the material facts as far as which students are perhaps being prioritized and which ones are not, I think that's important to recognize here. But I definitely hear you.
And Prem, to your point in your article, you point out that there are Jewish students on both sides of this equation, including one Jewish student you quote as saying that her mother was a Holocaust survivor, her grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, and she felt herself threatened as part of the pro-Palestine activist group, and that her comfort on campus was being threatened by some of the pushback. So thank you so much for all of your reporting and joining us here today.
Appreciate it.